the Nakajima Kikka, which means Tachibana Orange Blossom, was Japan's first turbojet-powered aircraft, and was intended for ground attack and anti-ship roles. Obviously, it bears a strong resemblance to the Messerschmitt Me-262, Germany's jet fighter, and the first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft in general. And many assume that they're exact duplicates, with the Kikka just being the Japanese version, but that isn't quite right. The Kikka did use the 262 as a basis, but was effectively built from the ground up. And had it actually entered the war, it would have had a crew of 1, a length of 9.25 meters, a wingspan of 10 meters, a height of 3.05 meters, a wing area of 13.2 meters squared, a maximum speed of 432 miles per hour, 696 kilometers per hour, with a range of 948 kilometers. But the Kikka never entered the war at all. They were working on a few prototypes, and one of them did fly, but it was way too late to the party to even consider using them in any real capacity. They just weren't ready, not in time, and honestly, even if they had been earlier, it probably wouldn't have mattered. They're still a relatively interesting story though, so let's talk about it. In 1942, the Japanese military attaché in Germany was permitted to witness trials of the Messerschmitt Me-262. And they were highly impressed. The 262 offered far superior performance over the prop planes that Japan was using, and, well, whatever one was using at the time. It was ahead of the curve, and the military attaché proceeded to write enthusiastic letters about the 262's performance back home to Japan. This would result in the Imperial Japanese Navy issuing a request to Nakajima to develop a similar aircraft, wanting it to be a fast attack aircraft. They wanted it to be able to be constructed with mostly unskilled labor, and they wanted the wings to fold, but not actually for use on aircraft carriers necessarily. They were more thinking that it could be hidden in tunnels and shelters around Japan to help defend the home islands. But Japan wasn't given exact design specifications of the 262. They only knew what it looked like, not necessarily all the details. So, designers Kenichi Matsumura and Kazuo Ono wound up creating an aircraft that did have a superficial resemblance to the 262, but had a lot of differences as well. For one thing, the Kikka was smaller, just 4/5 of the size of a 262, and had straight wings, like most conventional aircraft. The 262 didn't have fully swept-back wings, but they were slightly at an angle. The Kikka's weren't. The Kikka's fuselage also lacked the triangular shape that the 262 had, and to decrease total development time, they decided to utilize the landing gear based off of the A6M0s, and a nose wheel that was taken from a Yokosuka P-1Y bomber's tail wheel. The result was an aircraft that, yes, looked like a 262 to the untrained eye, but wasn't. And the power plants were different as well. Originally, they wanted to use TSU-11 motor jets as the primary power plants, and, what the heck are motor jets? That's a thing? And yeah, it was a thing for a while, though it never saw significant development. I've actually mentioned them before, as Italy was messing about with them too, and basically, well, the core of a motor jet is a regular, perfectly normal piston engine like you'd find in, well, anything that uses a piston engine. I mean, it's just a normal engine, except the engine isn't being used to drive a prop. It instead drives a compressor. The compressor compresses the air, and that is channeled into a combustion chamber where fuel is then injected and ignited. Due to the high temperatures associated with that, the gases expand and escape at very high velocity from the exhaust, similar to a modern turbojet. Motor jets generally weren't used though because they had some deficiencies. The technology never really matured at any point. Most designers realized they could get better, or at least similar performance out of a typical prop, but for a lot less money because it was familiar technology. But also, turbojets were coming into the fold, which offered way better performance than a motorjet could. So any research going into motorjet tech was basically abandoned. But in the Kikka's case, any motorjet designs they tested, whether it be the TSU-11, the NE-10, or the NE-12, just didn't work. well, they worked, but they didn't give enough power. Not to the point that the design would even be worth it. Yeah, it probably could fly, but not in a way that was any better than the props they were using. They needed something that was gonna go faster, because that was like the whole point, and for that they needed more power, and the motor jets just weren't giving it to them. But they also knew that their allies over in Germany have been working on proper turbojets, particularly the BMW 003, which did see use during the war on the HE-162, as well as the C-series of the AR-234s. But even utilizing that was going to be difficult, mostly because the Germans didn't actually give Japan, well, all the details for that either. They knew of the engine's existence and knew that it functioned, but all they had to actually build one were a few photographs and a single cutaway drawing of the internals. That's it. This is generally not enough information to throw a full-tilt turbojet engine together, and as a result, this project kind of stalled for a while, getting it into a state that worked, especially while they were, being bombed and their supply lines were being cut. It was difficult, but they did manage to get a functional jet engine out of this. The Ishikawajima NE-20, Japan's first turbojet engine. With the engine finally solidified, the Kikka project pushed forward, though it was mid-1945 and things weren't looking so great for Japan by that point. It's pretty bad, and had the Kikka entered service, it's unlikely that they would have been able to do anything. But they never got that far in development. In fact, they got so not far in development that they don't even have a proper designation. Kikka is their name, but that's their only name. Some sources incorrectly state that their designation was also J9N1, or sometimes J9Y1, but these seem to be completely made up, by somebody, at some point, because according to actual researchers who looked this stuff up, none of the records, officially, that were taken from Japan use either of these designations. They don't use designations at all. They only call them Kikka. Despite this, one of them did eventually fly. The first of the Kikkas commenced ground tests at the Nakajima factory on June 30th, 1945. Following that, it was sent off to the Kisarazu Naval Airfield to be properly flight tested. This didn't happen, though, until August 7th, 1945, the day after a certain bomb exploded over Hiroshima. Yeah, it was over. They were done. But they still pushed forward with testing anyway. Lieutenant Commander Susumu Takaoka piloted the prototype, and actually the Kikka performed pretty well. He found it a decent aircraft, with his only major complaint being the length of the takeoff run. The engines took a while to get going, and the prototype was not at all a short takeoff and landing craft. Certainly not at all suited for carriers, not that that really mattered by that point, because we sunk all the carriers. They didn't have any of those. A second test flight was to take place 4 days later, which was also about 4 days prior to Japan just flat out surrendering. So you can see how last minute all this was. But they wanted to address that takeoff issue, so they decided to utilize rockets. Oh, okay. Yeah, let's do that. It was a radar setup, rocket-assisted takeoff, to see if they can shorten the takeoff roll. The pilot, though, wasn't really crazy about this idea. Not because a radar is, like, something he couldn't handle, it was the angle they put the rockets on the Kikka. He didn't think it was gonna push it in the right direction, and as a result, caused the takeoff to not really go so well. This issue was not corrected, despite his common sense and experience. All they did was reduce the thrust of the rockets from 800 kilograms to only 400. Which is great, but that doesn't really solve the angle problem. By that I mean, 4 seconds into the takeoff roll, the radar was turned on, which immediately thrust the aircraft's tail down instead of, forward. Though both the turbojets were still functioning normally, the pilot really didn't have any control, at least via the tail, because it was shoved into the stupid runway. Eventually the radar time ran out, causing the nose to slam back down again. The gear held up, but there was a sudden deceleration, and at this point the pilot decided to abort the takeoff altogether because, but he had trouble slowing the Kikka down. He was able to steer her over a drainage ditch, which caught her landing gear, and she slid to a stop. The pilot survived, thankfully, and technically the Kikka could have been repaired, but there wasn't any time to do that. Japan's surrender came, and the war was over. At the time of the surrender, a second prototype was close to being done, and they were working on at least 23 more airframes. 5 of those were supposed to be two-seaters for training purposes. Post-war, America got their hands on what Japan had been working on, and naturally took a few back for further study. Specifically, airframes 3, 4, and 5. There's some debate over exactly how much we took, in fact. They may have also taken a few other partially constructed airframes as well, but no one's really sure. In the modern day, only 2 examples of this particular aircraft survive. The first is one that had been taken to the Patuxent River Naval Air Base in Maryland, and in the modern day it is very, very incomplete. And in fact, some think that she was basically stitched together from several different semi-completed airframes. That one is still in storage at the Paul E. Garber Preservation, Restoration, and Storage Facility in Silver Hill, Maryland. The second one, however, is on display at the NASM Udvar-Hazy Center in the Mary Baker Engine Restoration Hangar. This particular example has been a bit of a mystery. In 2001, the museum was able to get in touch with a Japanese propulsion specialist, Kazuhiko Ishizawa, to get his opinion on exactly what this particular Kikka was for. Ishizawa thinks that this particular airframe wasn't actually meant for flight testing at all. This is a load testing Kikka. The reason why he thinks this is that this particular model did come with some engine nacelles, but they were found to be too small to properly enclose the NE-20 engines, meaning that no one really knew how this thing was ever supposed to fly. The answer is that it probably wasn't, but at the same time, Ishizawa did admit that he could be wrong, because in his correspondence with others, including individuals at the Paul E. Garber facility, who have the other Kikka, remember, point out that it does have wiring, hydraulics, and controls, which, well, why would it have any of that if it was just for load testing? That doesn't make any sense. But Susumu Watanabe, who himself was in charge of engine outfitting for the Kikka, personally recalled that the engine nacelles of the strength tester were exactly the same as the standard aircraft, and that the strength tester was supposed to be stressed until failure to see exactly how much it could take. Based on all of this, it's actually believed now that the nacelles are, frankly, fake. They weren't the originals at all. They were instead added after she was brought to the United States and placed on her just for display purposes, not to actually house the proper engines, which explains why the measurements are completely off. In any event, the Kikka is an interesting story, but not one that was particularly long, nor one that probably would have changed anything. Even the 262, which did enter service in not insignificant numbers, didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It was just too late. The Allies were advancing, and even though the 262 was technically superior, there weren't enough of them to take on the hordes of aircraft that all the Allies were delivering at the time. I mean, yeah, had the Kikka gotten in the air, could it have done something? I mean, maybe something, but not anything that would have changed the outcome. Plus, it wasn't just too late, it was violently, outrageously, disgustingly too late. Remember, it first flew the day after the nuke dropped. It was over, but it's nice that at least a couple of the airframes survived. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.